Okay, our next session features Brian Ferguson, founder and CEO of Arena Labs. He's a former Navy SEAL who has brought the principles of elite performance into healthcare, helping clinicians and executives improve their adaptability, resilience, and leadership under pressure. His innovative approach integrates neuroscience, mindfulness, and tactical performances to help teams thrive in high-stress environments. Please welcome Brian Ferguson.
All right, good afternoon. I appreciate Brandy giving us a little bit of a break. I said I could be a wizard and come up here after 2 panels and without some break. I know it gets rough, but this is really fun for me. I'll tell my story in a little bit. But as all of you know better than me, when you go into a lot of these healthcare sessions, I've done a lot of talks, grand rounds, conferences. It often kind of misses a little bit of edge and spirit, and I love what Montecito's doing. And the diversity of content here, the people, it's been really fun for me. Our team, I'm gonna share some data, a little bit. A few folks in the audience went through our platform. But today what I wanna do, Dan Kraft, I actually know Dan was gonna be here. I've known Dan for about a decade. And I know some of you probably feel tired after his presentation. Maybe you're gonna just turn your license in right now and go retire. But it's inspiring stuff, and it's also exhausting. And the sub-narrative of what Dan got into that I'm so interested in is what's the human story behind all that? How do we think about building the teams of tomorrow? Done a lot of work at the intersection of robots and human systems. And a robot we can define as a minimally invasive technology. We can define it as AI platform, or just the software that you have stacked into your either clinical spaces or the spaces where you and your teams work. But I want to talk through the prism of high performance. Because when I started, I'll tell my story in a little bit, but I stumbled into your world of healthcare. And if this was a discussion on burnout prevention, most people would want to throw themselves out the window. No one needs another burnout prevention. Just like in the military, the PTSD prevention, right? It's very serious stuff. We know it's real, but we stack so much on it. A broken human narrative that says to me, Brian, you're broken, you will be broken. Even if it's true, I subtly move away from it. But we talk through the aspirational lens of human flourishing and human performance, we change our perspective a little bit. And what I want to do is talk through the prism of other high-pressure, high-stress disciplines. The reality is if I recognize we have an incredibly diverse room of license types. We have people who are dentistry, people leading teams that maybe weren't clinical, with people who've been orthopedic and heart surgeons. But if we were to really strip that back, and I was to say to you, why did you choose a life in medicine? Every single person here, there would be, I guarantee, some subtext is I want to help people, I want to serve, I want to steward human health. It is a sacred thing in society. Society needs people we call service archetypes at Arena Labs. The people willing to raise their hands to steward society. Teachers, first responders, military, healthcare. And what I want to talk about today is that medicine, I say this respectfully, is the last of the high-pressure, high-risk disciplines not to think about data for ourselves that makes us better, to have a longer career flourishing, not just as a clinician, but as someone in this room who's leading teams. And leading teams of tomorrow. So the provocation here, in the spirit of Dan's talk, I'm actually going to get into Moore's Law. We couldn't have scripted this better. Moore's Law most of the time never comes up, and Dan hit it a bunch in his talk. But what I would say more importantly, I don't care where you fall on ChatGPT, AI, large language models, how we're thinking about the integration of data. I believe the teams that will win in the next decade are those that are doubling down on the human narrative. And I want to get into why that is. Now, I've been lucky. In my intro, it touched a little bit. I was fortunate to have a prior life in the military, but for the last 20 years, I've been really fortunate to be humbly around some of the best teams and cultures in the world. And I love this idea of how do we pursue high performance. And high performance is not about doing more. Most people, in this room especially, something like the Physicians Wealth Conference, the people, you are in this room because you're a high performer. What that usually looks like is physiologically, you're degraded in some way and exhausted. High performance, most of us think about doing more. And I want to try to flip the narrative today that high performance is understanding what can I do less of. Now, in that spirit, where I'd start is indulge me for 30 seconds and think to yourself, when the word flourishing pops on the screen, who in your life do you know who's flourishing? Think about the first person in your life who comes to mind. However you define that. Everybody have someone in mind? So if a couple bold volunteers wouldn't mind indulging me, I'd love to hear who came to mind. So you shake your head, man. Yeah.
My husband.
Your husband, thank you. Why your husband?
Because he's pivoted into a life that he envisioned.
So if you couldn't hear in the back, she said, my husband, because he pivoted into a life that he envisioned. That's perfect. That's beautiful. I'm going to come back to why it is in a minute. How about a couple more? Yeah.
My daughter.
Your daughter. And why your daughter?
So this morning was my daughter's parent-teacher conference, and she had a great review, and just extremely proud of her and everything that she's accomplished, how hard she's worked in school.
That's beautiful. I literally have my daughter's, she's in first grade, her conference at 3:30 this afternoon. And yeah, I'm despite wanting to be tough, and I get emotional just thinking about that. Kids are perfect, and I'm going to come back to kids in a minute. Let me get one more. Yeah, Sinu.
My mother, she is 83, retired physician. Lost our dad about 4 or 5 years ago, but completely pivoted. She's learned like mahjong, bridge, stuff she's never done before in her life. And she got on a plane yesterday and flew to India to visit family.
That's beautiful. His mom's 83, lost her husband, learning new skills in life, got on a plane yesterday and flew to India. Sinu's mom, Sinu's a longtime friend, if you don't know Sinu, another very humble learner of just life in general, let alone cardiac surgery, but he invited me. He's got a crew that does a hike here in Nashville. I went about 2 years ago now. We came back after this hike in a trail here in Nashville, and Sinu's mom had beautifully prepared a nice Indian breakfast for us. And I was like, this is good living.
What he doesn't think is that we did that hike, and he takes his sweatshirt off, and he's wearing a rucksack with 50 extra pounds.
Yeah. I'm trying to keep everything. I'll tell you, on the days I think I'm tough, Winston and I work out together in the morning, and maybe I think I'm staying in good shape, but then I get next to the squat rack to Winston, and he's got like a truck on the rack. So it's all relative in life. So here's the thing, flourishing. It's such an important concept. The ability to guide my attention and my physiology so that I am fully engaged in what matters most to me. Your husband. Right? He makes presumably a shift, something he's not happy, because he knows he wants to go into something that he's dreamed of. That's a bold, courageous decision. Children are amazing. Children don't have a sense of time. Children are very clear on what matters. 6 years old, my daughter, it makes no sense that we're rushing for anything when we're having fun. Because kids know what matters and might as well just stay here. Sinu's mom, 83, reimagining life without her partner so that she can find fulfillment. I really believe that flourishing is the most inspiring of the human narrative. And when you know someone in your life, when I ask that question, the person that popped to mind, they probably popped to mind because they're living differently, whether they're 6 years old or 83. And in the modern world, of all the things Dan just took us through, it is harder than ever to be present in the things we claim to value. And what I want to talk about today, attention and physiology. Our attentions are wildly spread thin, especially as people leading in healthcare. And physiology is the one that's most overlooked. How do we sleep? What's our stress level? Can I manage my own nervous system? So there's two ways that we think about the world, right? There's endurance and performance. And again, when I say performance, this is not about doing more. You can think of it as flourishing. But in an endurance model, right, I have a set of stressors in my life, and that could be over a few years, a few decades. But in the course of that time, without the right tools, I diminish my energy. My energy slowly dissipates. So at some point, invariably, it's how long can I go before I lose passion, before I want to sell my practice, before I want to turn it over. In a flourishing or a performance model, I have the same stress landscape. None of us in the modern world are getting through life without stress. In fact, all of you would not have chosen your craft if it wasn't stressful. You want to do hard work for society. You want the responsibility of stewarding human life. But without the right tools, we end up on the left. But if we understand some basic elements of how do I sleep marginally better? How do I manage my own nervous system? How do I balance home and work? With those tools, the question is not how long can I go, but how good can I get? I tell the story often. About a year and a half ago, I gave a talk at HCA to 2,000 leaders. This is their Gulf Coast room, massive ballroom. And I said, so I don't ever make this mistake again. I said, how many people in this room are on the right-hand side of the screen? How many hands do you think went up? 0. Not a single person. And I said, to be clear, that's not because you're not high performing. In this room, everyone is on the right-hand side of the screen. You are a high performer, but your energy is not. You have not, most of you, have not been given the tools. And so people feel this heaviness when we say, look, I'm not on the right-hand side. Right? I live in this endurance model, and I'm trying to keep my head above water and survive. And I'm going to tell the story in a minute. I saw the same thing play out in the SEAL teams. And the reason I'm so passionate about this conversation is I know it can change. So I want to hit 3 quick parts here. And I promised Brandy, she gave me that 3-minute break because, again, I know if without a break, there's no way we're getting to lunch without you guys leaving. So I want to talk about the unique nature of your service. The reality is everyone in this room is different because of the work you've chosen, the responsibility that you steward. I want to talk about what makes that so hard, and then I want to talk about data, yes, for you, but for your teams. So the sacred world of medicine. That word sacred is incredibly important. You think what drew you to medical school, what drew you to healthcare? Not everyone in the world goes into a craft to do hard things for other people. And for our society to flourish more so than ever today, it requires a sacred decision. Now, outside of Sinu, who's seen this before, anybody know this photo? Yeah? Do you know the story on it?
I don't remember the whole story, but you did the first heart transplant, I believe.
Great call. So first heart transplant. Anyone add context to that? Any other thoughts? 20 hours long, yep. Anybody know where in the world? So this is the eastern bloc of Europe. This is the first heart transplant ever conducted. 1987 National Geographic Photo of the Year. By the way, I thought the most gangster thing Dan Kraft said this morning is he published an article on the cover of National Geographic. It's like, that's pretty awesome. Remember when National Geographic was like the thing? So remember, the National Geographic Photo of the Year, that was a consequential decision. It's similar to Time Magazine, Person of the Year now. Think about this, the 1987 National Geographic Photo of the Year. And the reason it captured the world's attention, Dr. Religa trained here in the West and went back to his home country of Poland to advance society in the country that had raised him. And it was said to be impossible to take a heart and put it from one body in the other, and it was sacrosanct because the Catholic Church in Poland did not allow it. So he had to go to the black market, he raised money, and it took 23 hours. John Stansman snaps this photograph at the end of 23 hours. What do you notice in the back right-hand corner? Yeah, it's actually his fellow. But nurse, fellow, you name it, you've all probably been there. And then what do you notice about Dr. Religa from the shoulders down? Yeah, slumped, exhausted, but look at his eyes. Wide open, they're almost willing that patient alive. We call that the inspired soul. The thing that makes this work sacred is that you all, in the darker, hardest moments, 23 hours into something that's impossible, you are willing a patient alive. And that is a beautiful thing for society. But if we don't have the right tools, we end up in the back right-hand corner. Now, I lived some of this. This emaciated little fellow who could use sunlight and a meal is me. In the 90s in Cleveland, Ohio, shadowing an orthopedic surgeon. I was telling Alden last night, I grew up in Cleveland, I wanted to go into your ranks. And the reason is this woman on the left. That's my mom. See her beaming in 1977, becoming a registered nurse. My dad, here in Nashville, his pleather coat would go for $2,000 in a thrift shop. The photograph on the right is our kitchen table. And I remember vividly being fascinated. My mom loved something outside the house I didn't fully understand. And on the rare occasions, this is in the days when instruments were thrown in the OR, not that that happens as much anymore, I don't know, or she lost a patient, you could viscerally feel that heaviness in her because she had that inspired soul. Now, I didn't go into medicine. I ended up having the privilege of getting to go into the SEAL teams. And the first thing I had to learn to do in the SEAL teams is understand, what am I afraid of? What does fear and anxiety feel like, and how do I manage that? How do I manage my nervous system? How do I perform under pressure? Yes, in the basics of training, but in the real consequential lives beyond training. And my last job in special operations was in our undersea clandestine operations unit, so working underwater in these mini submersibles. Any of you are scuba divers, you can see that. So this mini submersible is taken off the coast of Hawaii during the day. You've got 6 seals in the back of this. And those little bubbles, obviously, you're on mixed gas. If you're breathing mixed gas, that means you're not hydrating, you're not eating food, and you're in total darkness for up to 6 hours. Not a lot dissimilar from some of your clinical lives. I'm only half kidding, because we deliberately dehydrate ourselves, or we deliberately put ourselves in austere circumstances to get through tough moments. But my last job was understanding, how do we make this environment better from a human factors perspective? How do we look at the cutting edge of the best teams and science in the world to advance a SEAL operator in this austere environment? And it was a dream job for me because I got to collaborate. Sorry for that loud. Turn it down a little bit, guys. So if any of you have been to a cirque show, while it is entertaining, there is precision, yes, of the human body. But doing this night in and night out in Vegas requires just as much understanding of recovery, of rest, of energy management. Do we have any runners in the room? Anybody, any of you know who this is? Who is it? Eliud Kipchoge. And what's Kipchoge famous for? Sub 2-hour marathon. So you don't have to be a runner, but bear with me, this is nuts. I'm not a runner, for the record. So I got to collaborate with Nike. In 2014, Nike, so a gentleman named Dr. Michael Joyner, Mayo Clinic anesthesiologist, in 1994 writes a paper saying a human being could run a marathon in 2 hours, but that human would have to be anatomically unique, probably come from East Africa, and there'd have to be a very unique training cycle. So fast forward, Nike gets that paper, Nike Innovation, and in 2014 gets the top 3 runners in the world, one from Eritrea, one from Ethiopia, and Eliud from Kenya. If any of you have children or you're runners and you want to get into this, there's a phenomenal documentary on Nat Geo called Breaking 2. But here's the thing, to run a marathon in 2 hours, you have to run at a pace of 4 minutes and 33 seconds for 2 hours. That is 13.1 miles an hour. Next time you're traveling, or if you're at the Virgin tonight, after you've had a couple bourbons, get on the treadmill, 13.1 miles an hour, and see how long you can. It's nuts. Right? So let's watch Eliud.
Through hard work and discipline, he's pointing. Come on, he says. Eliud Kipchoge has the hand of history on his shoulder. He has less than 200 meters to go. Eliud Kipchoge, let's keep an eye on the clock, into the final 20 seconds. Eliud Kipchoge has on his shoulder. 140, the unofficial time.
There's his wife.
Eliud.
People in the room are smiling, you know who he is. You don't run. That's human flourishing just in a moment. When people do things beyond what we think a human's capable of, it is deeply inspiring. And we know it draws what's powerful about Eliud's story. You see him hugging his wife at the end. If you watch that documentary, it was never about him. It was about training the people in his village in Kenya and using them to help him be motivated and go to the next level. Got to work on Red Bull Stratos. This has been 14 years now. So Red Bull, sugar water company, they were collaborating with Google and NASA to take this gentleman, Felix Baumgartner, into outer space. So Felix rode a hydrogen balloon 24 miles into the stratosphere. This was called Red Bull Stratos. Anybody remember this? It was at the time the most widely watched event on YouTube. But think about going 24 miles into outer space. Now, if he exits appropriately, he becomes the first human to break the sound barrier, 833 miles per hour, Mach 1.25. But if you're 24 miles above Earth, you're in a vacuum. So the most important thing he has to do is perfectly step out onto, you can't see that little ledge where his body is. And imagine you get to this ledge, and you're 24 miles above Earth in a vacuum, and you have to perfectly fall and exit. Because if you over-rotate forward or sideways, you go into a spin, centrifugal force, you pass out, and probably don't come back to Earth alive. So this moment is intense. Let's watch him say, I'm coming home.
I'm going over. Jumper away.
Watch that like 50 times, my stomach still drops every time. But I ended up in your world. I got invited to the Cleveland Clinic Heart and Vascular Institute, and I went to watch 2 cardiac surgeries. I would say I was deeply impressed by the modern reality of medicine. But it was fascinating how similar it was to the world I'd come from in special operations. Small teams that you all work in, whether, again, you're in surgery, whether you're in dentistry, modern medicine, small teams, highly interdependent, deeply mission-driven, increasingly complex and dynamic, more so every day, given Dan's talk this morning. But ultimately, it's high consequence, no fail. Anything in life that is high consequence, no fail is stressful. And the only way that we can be successful in the face of that stress, and yes, the acute moments, but in the long arc of a career, is to deliberately train for stress. And what fascinated me is all these other environments where I'd had the privilege of training and working or learning from, there was a deliberate focus on three things. So you think about at the top there, special operations, the military, the performing arts, Cirque du Soleil, elite sport, whether it's professional or Olympians. All three of those, by the time I was in the military and the time I went to the Cleveland Clinic in 2015, they had specific data sets for self-awareness at the individual level, whether that was a whoop strap or a chest strap. And then with that data came a deliberate set of tools to manage stress. Yes, in the acute moments, but more importantly, in the day in, day out long arc of a career. And then the most important thing was this idea of recovery and regeneration. If I'm going to be successful as a SEAL over 20 years or 30, some people go 35 years, I have to be very deliberate about how we recover. And what fascinated me is in your world, whatever this photo is, whatever part of Montecito you fall in terms of where you work, the building you go into, I was amazed that generally speaking, none of this existed. And it wasn't because people didn't care, to be very clear. It's because the difference in your world versus all these others is twofold. One, you have more technical skill to acquire. Medicine, the things you have to learn for yourself and your team get steeper every day. But two, you're the only industry that focuses on the exogenous variable of the patient at the expense of yourself. And again, that's not being facetious. It's the reality of how you train is patient safety, patient quality. I would say the least important part of patient safety is the patient. Because you know on a hostage rescue, it's about the hostage. But I have an obligation to show up as ready and prepared as possible. And so this problem began to fascinate me, and I've spent the last 10 years in what we call high-performance medicine. And the provocative question we ask is, why don't we give all of you and your teams the same tools, coaching, and data as other high-stress, high-stakes fields, whether that's the military, the creative arts, or sport? And when we don't, this is how it starts to feel. And it's not to be melodramatic. And it's not unique to your space. I saw this play out in the last 20 years. And one of the things that's really interesting I want to get into is there is a difference in this room versus people who are stressed or burned out on the streets here in Nashville doing day-to-day corporate work. Because we know there's a cost to service. Who in here, has anyone heard the term allostatic load? It's relatively new. Dr. Bruce McEwen first started publishing on it in the 90s, but it became a very big foundation of our work in the SEAL teams to make these investments individually. This is where we'll get heavy for a minute, and then we're going to get into lightness, because there's solutions. But I think it's worth you have to go with the reality, which is that there is wear and tear on the body from stress. I love this graph. It's overly simple, but it really helped illuminate. In a minute, I'll talk about the gentleman who taught this to me. But if you think about when you came into medicine, when you first got out of medical school, let's say your resting heart rate was 60 beats a minute, your nervous system was well balanced between parasympathetic and sympathetic. So your heart rate variability, let's say, was 75 milliseconds. And your sleep architecture was healthy. When you fall asleep, you drop into deep, slow wave sleep, and then you move into rapid eye movement. And then you move through a career, right? In residency, maybe as a fellow, learning as an attending, and next thing you know, you've got a couple leadership roles, and now you're running a business. And throughout the arc of that sine wave, you take a couple long weekends, some vacation, but that recovery never gets you back to baseline. And so whether you're 10, 20, 30 years removed from that medical student, let's say your resting heart rate went from 60, now it's 75 beats a minute. And your HRV dropped to 30 milliseconds because you're stuck in sympathetic saturation. You've been programmed to be in fight or flight, taking care of people, worrying about patients, worrying about data. And when you fall asleep, your body is hungry for REM, and so your sleep cycles are backwards. That delta, that new altered set point, the difference from where we started is called allostatic load. And this was a huge shift in the SEAL teams and how we started to think about the way we train and well-being. Because what we know is the service archetype, you back to that inspired soul and Dr. Religa, willing that patient alive. As a service archetype, we will go beyond our body's capacity to get a mission done at the expense of ourselves without the right tools. So Dr. Robert Sapolsky, this is one of my favorite books, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcer. He first published this in 1994. He's a neuroendocrinologist out of Stanford. And Sapolsky's done a lot of prolific work on stress. Again, this was a big part of our work in the special operations community. But the title of this book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcer, what Sapolsky observed is that mammalian nervous systems are all very similar. And a zebra running from a lion, when that zebra is being chased, it goes into fight or flight, sympathetic state. And what that means is its pupils dilate, its respiratory rate goes up, it dumps glycogen into its muscles, it defecates most of its body fluids. And if that zebra survives, it goes somewhere on the prairie and it convulses and gets back to homeostasis. And Sapolsky's book looks at chronic disease rates in the modern world. And what he argues is the human nervous system, we create the same physiological response through psychological perception. And a lot of times it's email and stress and social media, managing teams, leading teams, the prior conversation, managing personal assets and assets for our business. And all those things put us in a sympathetic state. And so what I've learned is that the greatest superpower of the 21st century, especially in a room like this, is learning how to push the brake. Most of us as high performers are very good. We are maladapted to being in sympathetic state. We keep the pedal to the floor, and that feels comfortable and normal. And when you press the brake and you learn to press the brake, that's how everyone, when you talk about Sinu's mom and your husband and your daughter, those people who are flourishing, they understand their brake, whether they have deliberately trained it or not. And so what I'd argue is the long arc of a career, and many of you I know, I was talking to Bruce and Alden, I know some of you are at a point in your career where you're thinking about the next generation. And so this is as much for you as the people that you are mentoring and leading. But I would argue that, especially back to the talk this morning, when we think about the stressors, the subtext of AI and robots, and all, that only gets faster and harder. Deactivating is a superpower. And that's how we start building high-performing teams. Now, when we're in this endurance model, the question is, how do we get out of it? Because there's always this heavy subtext. And again, the reason I'm so passionate, this gentleman was a mentor to me, Dr. Kirk Parsley. Kirk had been a Navy SEAL. He went back to medical school. By the time I got to training, Kirk was the doctor overseeing all of the SEALs stationed on the west coast of California. And so Kirk started to study this idea of allostatic load and stress in SEAL operators. And so when I went through training, I had to wear a chest strap. I was part of the first Navy SEAL sleep study. I was getting cortisol swabs. He collected data on operators for 10 years. And in 2020, in the International Journal of Psychiatry and Medicine, published something known as operator syndrome. So if you don't mind indulging me again, operator syndrome may be understood as a natural consequence of an extraordinarily high allostatic load, wear and tear in the body from stress, the accumulation of physiological and neuroendocrine responses resulting from prolonged chronic stress and physical demands of a career with military special forces. And this is where I don't let you off the hook in this room, because we could easily stay on the front lines of healthcare. We see the same signature. The work I do day to day is putting sensors on frontline clinicians and leaders like all of you, and that signature is very similar. And so the question becomes, what do we do about it? How do I get to the right-hand side of the screen? And I'll tell you the thing for me, I was talking to Alden about this, I love living in Nashville. My biggest challenge is there's no water. And the reason I say that is when I was going through these studies and I was starting to learn from Kirk and I was learning these tools for human performance, when I had a chest strap on, I saw that anytime I got on the water to surf, I kid around, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, where surfing was synonymous with being a degenerate and a skateboarder. But then I moved to California and I fell in love with it. And if I went surfing or I stand-up paddled, my nervous system went from that sympathetic state into parasympathetic. I could literally see my signature, my body relaxing. My heart rate would drop 4 to 5 beats a minute. And I started to understand these basic tools after a stressful event, whether that was skydiving, training, or deployment, of how do I start to regulate my own body, which is an incredible sense of agency when we feel overwhelmed. And so the provocative question I wish we could spend more time on is, do you know what deactivates you? Have you really thought about that? And do you make time for it? Some of you know it, you don't make time. Others have spent most of your time building a prolific practice and managing your families, and that third thing doesn't exist. But I say it's usually incredibly simple. It's getting back to our innate physiology. It's being outside. It's being on the water. It's being with people you love. So I want to quickly, in my last 15 minutes here, get back into the conversation Dan opened up, and I want to get into data. And I want to make this feel, you can feel the heaviness in the room right now. I've learned I've got to be comfortable with it, because when you go at this in a room of high performers, most people, you never have this conversation. People just think you're superhuman. It's the same problem we had in special operations. But the beauty when you go at it and you start to say, what do we do about it? This is how we build even higher performing teams. But there's a different pressure of being a servant archetype stewarding human health. So this old school guy Dan brought up several times this morning, this is Gordon Moore, and what's Moore famous for? Moore's Law. And so Moore's Law, overly simplified, Dan said it many times, you saw charts, but Moore's Law says roughly, so in the 60s, Moore founded Intel, the Pentium processor company. And what he stumbled on is that roughly every 2 years, the amount of processing power in a computer chip doubles. So something doubling every 2 years is growing exponentially. The problem with exponentials is we are linear creatures. We age in a linear fashion, we move through our careers in a linear fashion. Something growing exponentially, we just can't really conceptually understand or pay attention to. Now, for me, this became more clear and palpable in 2012. This is when I first actually met Dan because of this problem. Anybody know what this is? A drone, and what's unique about that drone? Yeah, but what's on it? What's that? So that's retrofitted with a little can of explosives. This is a drone used by Al-Qaeda in 2012, a station in the Middle East. Irrespective of what you think about warfare, geopolitics, what's fascinating about this moment is the United States has spent billions of dollars fortifying U.S. bases, billions with a B. And almost overnight, a $150 drone on Amazon could be retrofitted with explosives and flown right over all that infrastructure and rendered it moot. And I found that fascinating. And I could sense that the world was changing, but I didn't understand it. And that's when I first went to Singularity University and started to learn about Moore's Law. But at the time, I used to think there's two types of leaders in the military and the world. There's leaders who understand that the world's changing faster and faster because of Moore's Law, and there's those people who want to hold on to the past. One of the fascinating quotes in Dan's presentation this morning was John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics, famous English economist, but what he said is it's not about new ideas, it's harder letting go of the old ones. And I always used to think there's two people. There's those who can let go of the old ideas and those who can't. And then I started to see how much Moore's Law was changing the world, just think in the last couple of years. I mean, at this point, I'm careful what images I put up because people feel such a visceral response to some of these things that it creates a sympathetic response. But think about the pace of change and keeping up. And again, where that starts to put us, because we're stacking more technology on top of a human system without the right tools. Any of you followed Simone Biles? What I love about that story, if you remember, she left the Olympics, and what did she spend 4 years focusing on? Herself, the tools. This young woman wildly overwhelmed by the demands of the modern stage. And then when you look at what's happening in corporate America, number one challenge, again, burnout. And so I started to realize it's not about these two types of leaders. Because understanding accelerating change is not enough. Think about Dan's presentation this morning. I've seen him give that many times. There's just new technology every time. And it feels equally exhausting. Leaders who change the world today understand how to manage their attention and their physiology. Back to flourishing. You think about those people in your life who popped up. If I can manage my attention and I can manage my physiology in the face of change and accelerating change, I still understand reasonable amounts of sleep. I understand how to balance my nervous system. It's a superpower. The break. Right? And this is not taught in schools, it's not taught in most of our lives, but it's especially not taught in the world of medicine. It was not in the military until 15 years ago. And again, this environment makes it unique. These people, all of us in this room, the service archetype, there's a different level of consequence. And so what I want to hit is what do we do about it? Let's make it aspirational in the last 10 minutes. Because there's incredibly exciting narratives that, interestingly, a lot of people in medicine say that's awesome, but it wouldn't work here, or that's just not us. And so I want to challenge that. We talk a lot about the world of predictive performance. What does that mean? Imagine in this room of 100 people, every one of us knew what requires the break. I know for me it's water. Sinu likes to walk the red trail on Saturdays with his friends. Maybe you enjoy just simply bike riding with your family on the weekends. But if you understand the thing that allows you to reset, to have active recovery, to feel a sense of agency in your life, In a room of 100 people, if we're collecting that data and we see our data improve, we start to see sleep improve because my mind isn't racing when I go to bed, and that nervous system gets more balanced. We can now get predictive and tell when this group is starting to get into a state of deficit and needs better recovery strategies. This is what's changed professional sport, it's what changed the creative arts, and it's what I saw change the military. It is the ability to measure and enhance individual flourishing across a team. We all want to feel like your husband, like Sinu's mom, like my daughter, that sense of groundedness in the things that matter. How many remember Moneyball? Brad Pitt, you can't forget, but he was in the movie. It was based on a book by Michael Lewis. And what was Moneyball? Anybody remember? What was that? Analytics. Sabermetrics. This has already been 20 years, which is scary. But what's crazy, at the time, the Oakland Athletics and the Major League Baseball had the lowest payroll. And Billy Beane, the general manager, started to see that much of baseball was predicated on gut instinct. This guy has it or this guy doesn't. And they started to put in place very specific individual data strategies to draft and develop players. That year, the Oakland Athletics went on to a 20-game winning streak in the playoffs against all odds. And sabermetrics was the first domino that started to radically change how we thought about data and performance. Now, 10 years later, there's a similar kind of major paradigm shift. The gentleman on the left, Greg Popovich, known as Pop, coach of San Antonio Spurs. He had won 3 NBA titles, and by 2010 to 2012, he starts to see the game is getting bigger and faster. And if I want to compete in the long arc of an NBA season, I need players like Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili to rest when they're not actually injured. And that way I can compete in the summertime. And so he starts getting fined for what's called load management. This has become very controversial if any of you follow the NBA, because now you go to a game and LeBron James is, you pay $500 to see LeBron play, and he's not on the court, he's resting. But at the time, this was driven by individual data sets. And it was brilliant because it gave the Spurs a competitive edge that other teams didn't. Even though someone's not injured, we know in an 82-game season with road trips, it makes sense to take a loss here and there so my players can be rested. Simultaneously, anyone know the gentleman on the right? I'd be really impressed if someone does. Any cyclists in the room? I hate cycling, for the record. Very inefficient on a bike. This is Sir David Brailsford. He led Team Sky. He was brought in by the Brits to get a Tour de France title in 2009. They gave him 5 years. He did it in 3. And he did it based on something called incremental gains. Incremental gains was the same idea. We have 100 people in this room. If each of us have data that shows every day we can be 1% better in our sleep, in our nervous system activity, and how we recover, in a cycling team, that compound impact over time builds champions. Brailsford went on and became knighted because of what he did in England. And then lastly, I told you my story earlier. At the same time, Kirk Parsley, we're learning from pro sports in the military. We're starting to build individual data sets so that a SEAL platoon or a SEAL team can be much more lethal and effective when deployed overseas. And then 2020, right, just about 5 years ago. Now, I know Dan asked earlier, but how many people in the room have a wearable sensor? It's about a quarter, maybe close. So whatever sensor you wear, there's strong opinions, Garmin, Apple Watch, Oura, Whoop. Here's what's important about all of it. For the first time in human history, we have population-level data on the average person. It's actually wildly consequential. You all know that it used to be IRBs and studies or people who are sick and getting polysomnogram in a hospital because they didn't know how to sleep. And now, night in and night out, we get hundreds of millions of data points on healthy human beings. And we're starting to reimagine what data looks like in society. And one of the things that we've started to really understand is the two-way relationship between mental health and physical health. And this, again, is what started to really change the SEAL teams. Back to the broken narrative of burnout. Yes, there is a point in time in your world, just like the military, where the things you are asked to do or the things you see require a different level of resources and healing. But day in and day out, if I am exhausted by the emotional toll of leading teams and taking care of people, it's not always the mental I should focus on. Because if I am chronically underslept, getting 4.5 hours of sleep, and I'm maladapted in a sympathetic state, mental health work is not going to help that. And so we started to focus on the physiology to change the psychology. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating when you look at the Federal Aviation Administration and the amount of changes, I was telling this story earlier today, for those of you who flew here, if you came by way of airplane, the FAA regulates crew rest for the flight attendant crew, and that is based on a lot of hard lessons learned. And by the way, if you need surgery tonight at Vanderbilt, someone can be up for 3 days and no one asks a question. Now, there's a whole different discussion. I recognize it's a hard problem to solve. But the FAA started to understand the impacts of chronically being underslept and error in focus. But if we take it out of that into something lighter, right? Rory McIlroy. If any of you follow Rory and you look at how he thought about recovery, the way he trains his mind around sleep. Yes, he's a professional golfer, but asymmetric marginal advantage comes from understanding his own data set. I do work in the NBA, the Brooklyn Nets. The NBA, it sounds cool, but it is overly saturated with data. This is something called catapult data. It literally tracks every movement on the floor at all times. But it's powerful. One of the things they look at is deceleration. We know that an NBA player who spends more time decelerating than normal is at a heightened risk of injury. This starts to become predictive, and it gives marginal competitive advantage. And so what does that start to look like in frontline healthcare? This is the question I love. It doesn't need to be catapult data and millions of data points. It's usually incredibly simple. This is a leader we recently worked with on Oura Ring, and I said, Jamal, forget the scores on the left. If you notice his resting heart rate's 39. He's 45 years old. I'm like, you're Yoda, Jamal. But his heart rate variability, 81 milliseconds. It's really healthy for a 45-year-old male. I said, why does your data look so good? He said, I had a great workout. I coached my daughter in basketball. I prepared for travel. I had a fun evening with my family. I was present, and I hydrated, and I got good sleep. Insanely simple. But if you understand that and you know how to put it in play, there's asymmetric advantage. Yes, for you and your patients, but also for your team. And then this flip side is the same. When you wake up and I'm not saying you should live your life based on what your Oura Ring or your Whoop or your Apple Watch tell you. But we can't change what we don't measure. And most of us don't. We know intuitively we're underslept, but we don't know how underslept. We don't know where that shows up. I want to quickly, I know we had a couple minutes here. A couple of our MVPs in the room. Had a great conversation with Alden and his wife last night. They actually own a yoga studio in Charlotte, so they go real deep on some of this stuff, which I love. But Alden, if you wouldn't mind just sharing. So I don't like to come up here and promote our work day to day, but our work at Arena Labs is coaching people like you. And so it's always interesting to understand, what does someone need? But what you find interesting is really basic tools can show up in interesting ways. So Alden has had a very successful career as an orthopedic surgeon. And he was saying there's still these micro moments where there's times I might get anxious. Maybe share your story about using the breath.
Yeah, so we do anterior approaches to the spine. You're operating basically between the iliac vessels, and you have the vascular surgeon there with us to do these approaches. And there have been some times where you get excessive blood loss because of an injury to one of those vessels, and those are very trying moments where you're basically at that point going from doing something that's very elective to trying to save somebody's life. And you have to learn how to adapt in a very, very high stress moment to really, it is the one time where we're actually literally trying to save somebody's life. And they weren't shot, they're not coming into the ER as a trauma patient. It's something that's happened really because of what you're doing. So it's, again, very high stress. And, anytime, when you've been through that experience, anytime you start to see any bleeding in these cases, particularly I'm in a training environment, so we have residents and fellows, and you may not be the one who's actually physically looking in the wound when this is going on, but when you start to see blood, you have to kind of, your initial response is, okay, high stress moment, I don't know what's going on, how do I have to adapt, and using truthfully the breathing has been exceedingly helpful in terms of this de-stressing moment.
Yeah, if you didn't hear that at a basic level, he was saying that one of the things in our platform we teach is the physiological side of the de-stress breath. Super simple breathing mechanism to reset the nervous system. It's called a tactical pause, right? What do you look at, someone before a big free throw in a game? But the instinct is to dive into the problem, into the crisis. One of the things you talk about in special operations and sport is tactical pause, breathe. And Alden was sharing that what this particular technique you've used, he was saying, I've used this a couple times. And I just find that inspiring and so simple and profound. Because as elite professionals, we often forget the basics. And that's where we start to change the landscape, is what is the simple break that I can push in a high-stress moment so I don't, even if I can handle it, so that I can down-regulate momentarily. Bruce, anything you want to share in your own wisdom and experience?
As I told Brian, I said I'm probably the worst person to do this.
These guys, by the way, went through 8 weeks of coaching with our team on our platform.
Program, and I did it mainly so Melissa and Brandy wouldn't get mad at me.
Peer pressure is always a good.
So I agreed to do it, but I told fascinating to see how my numbers were, but I still was able to see improvement. And for me, it was more about the realization. I started talking about it. Ironically, in the middle, at the very end of my training, I was with two other couples, high school friends in Italy. And every morning they would ask me how my numbers were and how my sleep was, what my numbers, and totally unrelated to the bottles of wine we drank the night before. But it became part of the conversation of, and all of a sudden you're taking control of these things.
Yeah.
In the past, I would go to sleep, and I wouldn't sleep very much, I would sleep very poorly. Now you're focusing on some of the tips and tricks to control that part of your life.
Yeah.
I don't take Nycol anymore, and so, like I said, I'm probably not the best candidate as I'm on the tail end of my career, but the reality is we all have stress.
Yeah.
And stress comes in many different ways, and you learn how to manage it. It's funny, Alden and I are in the same practice. We had no idea we both were going through it at the same time, which is probably good because we would have started comparing and it probably would have altered our results. But it's more the realization of you start making conscious decisions about what you do rather than just dealing with it or not dealing with it and just having the negative repercussions.
Yeah, and I think most burnout is a lack of a sense of agency. And so whether it's our work or any of you find, if someone challenges you, I was saying to Dan earlier, the Hawthorne effect is powerful. When you wear a sensor and someone sees your data, you change your behavior, and I think that's good. Because if that behavior is better and you start to feel better, it's powerful. But everyone in this room, one of the things I'm so passionate is when you start to normalize a conversation about performance, not burnout prevention, you begin to look at the world a little bit differently. Now, I know I'm actually just over here, so let me end here where I started. When I think about this room, I really believe in the next decade, the top medical practices in the world, however you currently define that, wherever you sit, are going to do three things. It's seeing talent in service, right? Because the work you do is different. The people who come to work for you, yes, they want a paycheck, but they would be doing something else if they just wanted to make money. And in the modern world, we forget that service is a powerful leverage to get people to learn and be better. Understanding that as leaders becomes a competitive advantage. And then training for self-regulation. I will tell you this, I've been doing this for a decade now. Unequivocally, when I come up on a team that has a deliberate way that they train their people to manage stress and pressure, and it is seen that I'm gonna be a high performer, which means I'm not gonna just work and crush until I collapse. I'm gonna do the things I need so that I can be marginally better every week. That's the next ridgeline of clinical excellence. And then using data to regularly redesign human operations. The reality is that robots and much of the technology Dan talked about is coming. I don't want to sound Pollyannish. But it doesn't mean that it makes the human system any less stressed. When we have data, we can redesign our system so we get more out of the human to be present and better, yes, with our patients, but with themselves and with us. And so I leave you with this image. Great respect for the inspired soul that all of you bring. My challenge to you is, what is the work you need to do so that you don't end up in the back right-hand corner and that inspired soul allows you to be the leaders I know all of you want to be? With respect, thank you guys very much.